Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from lunch. We now proceed with the second half of our program. And I would like to invite Dr. Michal Koreh, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Taub Center for Israel Studies in New York, a graduate of the Hebrew University, and an expert on welfare policies. Michal will talk about the hidden dimensions of welfare state retrenchment. Michal.
When Ron Zweig asked me if I would be willing to present in this conference, I knew I received a very challenging opportunity. A challenge of delving into the historical and theoretical materials of my research and asking the very troubling questions, can they be relevant in any way for Israeli society today? And if they can there any meaningful lesson be drawn from them to the very exciting agenda social justice movement has brought back of a new renewal of politics and welfare policy politics in particular. And so what am I, or where am I coming from? I'm a political economist of the welfare state. And my research deals with understanding the forces of welfare state expansion on the one hand and welfare state retrenchment on the other. I look on what explains welfare state development from a lens that is not usual. I look on the politics or the political economy of social insurance financing. I ask, what are the political interests, the economical interests that drive decisions, for example, to increase contribution levels or to decrease them? And then I ask, what impacts do these decisions have, or how they feed back into the construction of social policy? Now, as social scientists, we are all aware of the important differences between normative and empirical types of research. Normative research is interested in how things should be or ought to be constructed. How should housing policies look like? How should poverty policies look like? While more empirical types of research are interested in the question of how these policies are actually coming to life. What shapes them? What influence? Why some states allocate for their welfare maybe twice than others? Why some welfare state create certain policies that others don't? Now, why am I bothering you with this idea? Is because when I prepared for this presentation, for this lecture, I skimmed the materials of the committees or of the different committees that arose in response to the social justice movement. The formal committee, the Trachtenberg Formal Committee, and the alternative committee, the Spivak and Yona. And when I was looking at the very interesting proposals they were putting forward, I was struck by the normative agenda that was guiding them. Both of them, though very different in some respect, and I'll maybe touch on that shortly, both of them tried to describe how an enlightened Israeli welfare state should look like. From housing through social security, until transportation. How should those programs be constructed? What should be the levels of benefits? What should be the rules of entitlement? And checking they are different, of course, in how radical they are or how far they go with their proposals. But I think the main differences between those two committees is regarding the question of fiscal feasibility. While the formal committee has limited itself to the limitation of the budget, saying, yes, we need change, but it should be a change in priorities. Maybe we need more housing and less expenditure on military. The alternative committee said, yes, it is a change in priority, but not only. We can and we should allocate more resources for that and provide more benefits, expand the coverage, lead more. Now, while I was very taken by the ideas, and personally I was more taken by the alternative proposals, I was quite struck that none of them were addressing the questions of how we get there. And I will say more than that. They don't look on how we get there in the respect that they look on the outcomes. What do we want? And implicitly, according to my reading, there is this implicit assumption in it. And what is this implicit assumption? What we need for a better welfare state is to have political forces like the mass protests on the one hand, but then we need to have a detailed and professional vision of how the welfare state should look like, conditions that it's fiscally feasible. And the question I want to put forward, is this really enough? Is this really what we need? And I think it is in this place where going back to history and asking how welfare states developed over time might give us interesting lessons. And I have, my presentation today has one picture, and it's the picture of the iceberg. And the argument is that social proposals today look at the tip of the iceberg. They look on the outcome. But the question is, how did we get to these outcomes? What created the welfare state in its formation periods, and what eroded it in recent periods? And the argument I would like to put forward is that welfare state renewal requires that we will shift the attention to the procedural and institutional reforms that perhaps can fix the playing field of Israeli welfare state politics. And in this regard, I think I would like to connect to Eran Yashiv's presentation this morning, who talked about the political obstacles, the electoral political obstacles. And I would like to argue that while electoral politics are crucial, there are also the politics of organized interests. And I refer to the politics that impact the day-to-day decisions on programs, on benefit levels, on entitlements. And the question is, what are the kinds of interests that get the opportunity to enter those policy debates and influence them on the day-to-day basis? And I think that the feeling, one of the issues that were raised here this morning, and may I quote Yossi Shavit quoting Bloomberg, that those protesters don't know what they want, but they want it now. But I think what they do want, or what they feel they don't get anymore, that I'm not sure they feel that their interests are being represented in the processes of policy making, and that their ability to vote once in 4 years, or in Israel they get it every 2 years, I'm not sure that it's an advantage, doesn't really entrench their ability to affect policy. And I would like here to quote the former Prime Minister of Spain, Felipe González, when explaining the differences between the Arab Spring and social justice movement. And he said, interestingly, in the Arab world, they are demanding the right to vote, while here they are saying voting is pointless. And yes, I think, not that I agree that voting is pointless, I think it's crucial, but I think it's not enough. It's not sufficient. And the politics of representation is critical. And the question is, what are the institutional capacities and procedures that affect the responsiveness of government to the interests of different groups in society? Are they responsive to the needs of whom are they responsive to? Is it of the working class, of the middle class, of large corporations? Who are the ones that get to influence the day-to-day decisions, the very mundane and boring technical procedures that may have enormous effect on policy outcomes? And before getting into some examples of my own work, I would like to illustrate it by a more familiar historical example of the struggles of labor for proper wages and decent working conditions. And I think we are all quite aware that together with struggling for better wages, the tip of the iceberg, and the working conditions, they struggled for creating their capacities to influence policy by getting the right to unionize, the right to strike, the right to engage in collective bargaining, the right to be part, particularly in corporatist types of governments, to be part of the day-to-day decision-making of the state politics. In some countries, they had more power to do so. In others, they had less. And I think the argument, well, if I put my argument in one sentence, I think the shift has to be now to see what are those institutional arrangements, procedures that bring to the outcomes of better wages, of better health care, of better education, and not just how they should look, because how they should look, I think we know already quite fair. We have many, many examples from social democratic states, from corporatist states, from liberal states. We have those examples. But the question is how to get there. And an interesting research lately on this topic showed not only how much these capacities, and I gave the example of labor, but it's not the only example, were important in building the foundations of welfare and in mobilizing the working class and bringing it to the achievements it came to in the post-war period. But they also show that when we look on the politics of retrenchment, this is where work has been done, or where major part of the story is. And I think many of us, particularly in the social policies, know that when we try to look on expenditure on social issues, it's very difficult. There is this general feeling that something is changed, that things have been retrenched, but it's not easy always to put the finger what exactly had occurred. And the story is many times in the very little details. In the very little details that while, for example, minimum income law has not declined, or maybe even a little bit increased, his ability to provide adequate wages, an adequate wage, has dramatically declined over the years. And we can see that, we can see those drift processes, that many of the benefits are there, and the institutions are there, but their ability to provide us with the initial goals that guided them are declining. And shortly, how are you in charge of the time? 10 minutes. Shortly, I would like to go to the story of social insurance, which is my field of expertise. And it's now also debated. We want to have higher benefits. We want to have expanded coverage. Going back to history and to the struggles over the introduction of social insurance in Israel, we see that that was part of the struggle. But equally important, and I would say even that the most difficult or radical debates were not just on which programs I'm referring to the 50s with the introduction of the social insurance institution in Israel, which would be the programs, but the questions that were debated, for example, who would control it? Would it be by the unions? Would it be by the government? If it would be by the government, under what ministry? That might seem very technical, but they knew, for example, that if it would be under the Ministry of Welfare, it will have very little power. While if it would be under the Ministry of Labor at the time, it would be politically stronger, and its ongoing ability to develop and increase would be much higher. They also debated things that might look very technical, how to finance the system. Should it be financed by taxes? Or should it be financed by social insurance contributions? To a regular ear, it can sound completely technical. But they knew that if it would be a tax, it will create a very different sense of entitlement than if it would be a social insurance contribution, like a contract that I am contributing today for the benefits of tomorrow, creating a different kind of entitlement that would enhance the future prospects of such a system to provide an ongoing social insurance, and would be politically more difficult to retrench or to cut. And this system indeed grew quite significantly. I give, for example, in the 1970s, the expenditure on social insurance in 1 decade tripled, almost tripled, from 2.9% of GDPs to more than 7% of GDP. And social reformers at that time noticed another mechanism that social insurance contributions create in difference to taxes. They create, for example, very visible funds that are earmarked to welfare. And for different reasons, I'd be happy to answer if somebody is interested in the discussion. The Ministry of Finance had interest in raising social insurance contributions for his own fiscal needs of financing the war of attrition at the time. But when he did so, he created, probably not I'm not sure he meant that, but he created very large and visible surpluses of social insurance funds that then became a political leverage to demand expansions in child benefits, in old age benefits, and in employment benefit, not only expansion, but really the creation of unemployment insurance. Responding to this force or to this power of the system, what we see, if we go in the 80s and 90s, is we see that there is no change in the government doesn't cut expenditures. It does so only in 2003 and 2004, where radical cuts in social insurance are introduced. But what it does, in the foundation of this iceberg, it is changing very quietly outside the public debate. It changes the financing structure of social insurance. It decreases employer contributions by more than 70% and replaces them by taxes, by state funding. And over a decade of doing this very gradually, what happens is that social insurance, from having that is its major financing source are autonomous social insurance contributions, the main financing source is now budget funding, and it's totally dependent on the Ministry of Finance. In 2003, this becomes the institutional preconditions that enables those dramatic cuts that we see in 2003 and 2004. It not only enables the government that is holding those resources, but it also is the start of changing the legitimacy of cutting, because one can say it's not anymore social contributions, it's a parallel tax system. And we can't talk anymore about entitlements that are built on participating in contributing to this system. I would like to summarize in suggesting to look not only on the tip of the iceberg, but as social scientists to ask ourselves, what were the mechanisms that the government, that I will frame it differently. If we ask, what are the mechanisms on which the government responsiveness to the interest of the working class or the middle class was built on? What were those mechanisms? What happened to them over time? Did they have their own self-demise mechanisms sometimes? Were they strategically changed by strategic directions either from the government or from organized interests, other organized interests? And then the question, can we reconstruct them? Is it possible? Or what should be the alternative mechanisms that we might look at that can provide the same, that can provide the same idea of guaranteeing responsiveness of government to the interests of the working class. Thank you.